People always ask how a grown man dies from a house pet. I used to laugh at those stories too. Some idiot feeding a tame ferret straight from his palm. Some fool letting a harmless snake curl around his neck for a photo. Some woman on the news insisting through tears that her python had never once shown aggression in 9 years, right before the segment cut to the coroner's report. Then it happened to me, and I stopped laughing, because now I was the punchline. Her name was Toothless. I want that on record before anything else, because I've spent my whole second life listening to people assume I died in some heroic, tragic, at least interesting way, and the truth deserves better than their imagination. My little sister named her when she was 6 years old, and the Martin thing had all her baby fangs pulled by the breeder for safety, which is precisely why the name stuck. Toothless slept in the pocket of my hoodie for 4 years running. Toothless licked spilled yogurt off my fingers every single morning without fail. Toothless was, by every metric a reasonable adult could measure, the single least dangerous animal in the Northern Hemisphere, and I would have staked my life on that fact. I did, as it turned out. That's the joke. One Tuesday, for no reason anyone in my old life ever managed to explain to my family's satisfaction, she bit down on the soft skin between my thumb and forefinger and did not let go. I didn't even feel angry at her. That's the part that still bothers me, wherever still is supposed to mean anything for a dead man. I felt confused. The way you feel confused watching a machine that's worked flawlessly for years suddenly do something it was never built to do. I looked at the blood welling up between my fingers and thought, weird, with the same detached curiosity you'd give a spilled drink. Then my vision narrowed at the edges like a camera aperture closing. My knees found the kitchen tile hard enough to bruise, and the last sound I heard in that life was my own heartbeat losing its rhythm, stumbling over itself like a drummer who'd forgotten the song halfway through. Some allergic reaction, the doctors told my family afterward, over a body that wouldn't respond to a single thing they tried. Some freak enzyme buried in her saliva that had sat dormant her entire domesticated life and simply chosen that one unremarkable Tuesday afternoon to wake up. It didn't matter what the medical report said. I was 31 years old, reasonably healthy, mildly successful at a job I didn't hate, and I died on my own kitchen floor because of the single most trustworthy creature I had ever personally known. I tell you this first, before anything else, because it is the joke the universe apparently decided to build my second life around, and I have come to believe, in the time since, that whatever force reincarnates people has a sense of humor. Cruel, perhaps, but never, ever subtle. There was no tunnel of light waiting for me on the other side. No grand voice booming down judgment. No council of gods debating my fate over a table I couldn't see. There was only dark, and then somewhat less dark, and then I was lying face down in wet leaf litter, with a headache like a spike driven clean through both temples, breathing air that smelled of pine sap, and something coppery underneath it. Blood, though not mine, I'll come to learn soon enough, and not human either. I lay there long enough to catalog the wrongness of it. The ground was too soft, the kind of soft that comes from centuries of undisturbed forest floor, not the packed dirt of any trail I recognized. The light filtering through the canopy above me was the wrong color, too gold, too thick, like honey poured through green glass. Somewhere off to my left, something large moved through underbrush with a weight and unhurried confidence that no animal back home would have carried so close to a fallen man. The first genuinely impossible thing I saw, once I finally lifted my head, was a floating rectangle of pale light hovering exactly where a phone notification would sit if I'd still been holding a phone, exactly where my eyes would land if I glanced sideways without thinking. I stared at it the way you stare at anything that has no business existing, waiting for it to blink away like an after-image from staring at the sun too long. It did not go away. So eventually, with nothing better to do and a headache too large to think past anyway, I read it. Host: unregistered. Former designation: human, Earth origin. Class: undetermined. Gift bestowed: Warden's bond. Description: any creature whose mortal wound you personally close, through effort, skill, sacrifice, or care, will recognize you, from that moment until its death, as its alpha. This bond is absolute. It cannot be severed by any third party, and it cannot be revoked by you, even at your own wish. Choose your patients carefully. You cannot unheal them. I read it 4 times through, slower each time, the way you reread a rejection letter, hoping the words might rearrange themselves into something better if you just look hard enough. Then I laughed, alone, on my back, in a forest that wasn't Earth, with someone else's blood drying tacky on my hands, because, of course. Of course, the thing that killed me back home was a bite from a creature everyone, myself included, had trusted completely. And the thing I get handed in trade is the exact same principle running backward. The power to make monsters trust me, the same absolute, irreversible way. If there is some cosmic committee assigning these gifts, I would very much like to file a formal complaint about their sense of humor. I don't expect it would go anywhere. I filed it out loud into an empty forest anyway, and the forest, predictably, didn't answer. I didn't get a sword out of that light. I didn't get some blessing that turned me instantly into a sword master. Didn't get a prophecy naming me the chosen anything. Didn't get stat points to pour into strength or agility, or any of the neat little categories every story back home promised a man in my position. I got a gift that only activated once something else was already dying, which meant, functionally, that my entire cheat code required me to go looking for tragedy before it did me any good at all. I want to be scrupulously honest about how unimpressive that felt, lying flat on my back in the mud of a new world. Every isekai fool I'd ever read about back home got handed a cheat that turned him into something close to a god by the 3rd chapter. I got a gift that demanded I find something broken first, that offered me nothing at all until I'd already bled a little on someone else's behalf. It felt, frankly, like being handed a rusted first aid kit and told, with a straight face, that it was Excalibur. I did not yet understand what a rusted first aid kit is worth to a dying creature that has never, in the entirety of its miserable existence, been shown a single ounce of mercy by anything with hands. I would learn. It would take considerably longer than I expected, and it would cost considerably more blood, mine this time, mostly, than I was prepared for. I got my name back before I got my bearings, which felt, in hindsight, like an appropriate order of operations for the life I was about to build. A woman's voice, sharp, entirely unimpressed, remarkably unmagical for a world that had apparently just resurrected me from another dimension, was the second thing to reach me, cutting clean through the ringing still lodged behind my eyes. "You're not dead. Shame." Thought I'd finally get some peace and quiet out here for once. I turned over, slow, every joint reporting for duty a half-second late. An old woman stood at the tree line, sleeves rolled past her elbows, hands stained dark to the wrist with something that could have been dye or could have been blood, most likely both in equal measure. Her cottage sat behind her, low and crooked, and settled into the hillside like it had grown there rather than been built, ringed with drying herbs strung on twine like decorations for a celebration nobody sane would willingly attend. That was Mira. I didn't know her name yet. I only knew, in that first look, that she was studying me the exact way you study a stray dog that's wandered too close to your porch steps. Not cruel about it, not warm either, just running the calculation of whether feeding it once would obligate her to feed it forever, and clearly having run that calculation many times before, with results she didn't love. "You've got the mark," she said, before I'd managed a single word of my own. She wasn't looking at my face at all. She was looking at the space just above my shoulder, at the exact spot where I'd later learn my status window hung, visible to anyone with a particular sight to read it. "Warden's bond. Haven't seen that old gift walk through these woods in longer than you've likely been alive, wherever it is you crawled out from." "It's a gift," I said, mostly because my mouth still worked, even though my brain hadn't caught up to the conversation. "People keep telling me it's a gift." "It is." Something moved behind her eyes I couldn't place yet. Not mockery, not quite pity either. Something closer, I'd realize much later, to old grief worn smooth by handling. Provided you've got the stomach for what it actually costs to use it properly. Most don't. Most take one look at what the gift demands and decide a sword's simpler. "What does it cost?" She didn't answer that directly. She turned back toward her cottage instead, already finished with me for the moment, tossing her last words over one shoulder like scraps flung to that same stray dog. There's a warlord's mount half dead in a gully 2 miles east. Culler's arrow gone septic in the wound, most like, by the smell that's been carrying on the wind since yesterday. If you've got that gift, and you've genuinely got the stomach for it, go earn your first friend before the crows beat you to the carcass. I didn't know then, lying in the mud with my head still splitting, that she'd just handed me the entire architecture of my second life in a single throwaway sentence. I only knew my legs still answered when I asked them to, and something 2 miles east was dying, and for reasons I couldn't have fully explained to anyone, myself included, I got up and started walking. Before I did, though, I asked her the 2 questions any reasonable dead man would ask a stranger who clearly knew more than she was volunteering. Where am I? And what am I supposed to call this place? She paused at her door, not quite turning back around. Aldervane, if you want the kingdom's name for it. Border Woods, if you want the practical one, no crown patrol worth mentioning, no lord's writ that reaches this deep, which is precisely why the company operates here the way it does. You're a long way from wherever you actually died, boy, and further still from anywhere that's going to hand you answers for free. A beat. The site lets you read that little floating window of yours. Most folk out here can't see it at all. Keep that to yourself unless you trust the person standing in front of you not to use it against you. Class undetermined, I said, mostly to myself, testing the words out loud the way you test a loose tooth with your tongue. Does that ever change? Everything changes, given time and enough bleeding, she said, unhelpfully, and went inside without another word, leaving me alone with the manticore-shaped problem waiting 2 miles east and a head full of questions nobody seemed inclined to answer in full. I want to admit honestly that some small and embarrassing part of me had hoped for more in that first hour. A grander system window, some hidden stat sheet waiting to be unlocked, the kind of dramatic unveiling every story back home promised a man who'd just died and woken up somewhere new. What I got instead was a single gift with a nasty asterisk attached, an old woman who answered questions with more questions, and a 2-mile walk towards something that smelled like it was already halfway to dying. It did not feel, in that moment, like the beginning of anything heroic. It felt like the world's most understaffed emergency shift, and I was the only one who'd shown up for it. Chapter 2. The First Stray. 2 miles is a considerable distance to cover on legs still learning they belong to you, in boots that hadn't existed when I closed my eyes the first time and had simply been there, laced and worn in when I opened them the second. I didn't question the boots. I didn't question much of anything yet. There's only so much impossibility a mind can process in one morning before it starts triaging, filing the merely strange under "deal with later" to make room for the immediately dangerous. I just walked, following the smell Mira hadn't needed to describe in any detail. Rot and rust and old fear. The very specific stink of something large enough to be genuinely dangerous and now too weak to be anything but pitiable. I found the manticore in a gully choked with bramble and fallen deadwood. One foreleg bent at an angle nature had never intended for it. An arrow shaft snapped off flush against its ribs, with the head still buried somewhere in the meat beneath. Its scorpion tail, the part every story ever told about manticores insists you fear above all else, lay slack and trailing in the mud, coiled loose and forgotten, like the creature had simply run out of reasons to lift it in its own defense. It saw me before I saw the whole of it. One golden eye, unsettlingly human-shaped in a way that turned my stomach the first time I registered it properly, tracked me from 20 feet out, and every visible muscle went rigid at once. Not the rigidity of a predator gathering itself to charge, the rigidity of something that has learned, specifically and repeatedly, and at considerable personal cost, that men approaching on 2 legs mean more pain arriving, never less. I stopped exactly where I was and did the only thing I could think to do in the moment, which was to make myself as thoroughly unthreatening as a grown man standing in a gully can manage. I sat down in the mud. I put both hands where the creature could see every finger, and I talked, low, constant, saying nothing of any particular importance, just filling the space between us with a voice that wasn't shouting and wasn't, as far as I could make it sound, a weapon of any kind. It took the better part of an hour before it allowed me to close the distance to arm's length. It took another hour past that, and blood I hadn't planned on losing from a shallow scrape its tail gave me, half by accident and half as a final test, before it let me lay a hand anywhere near the wound itself. I want to be clear that I am not a healer. I had no spell to offer it, no potion glowing with convenient plot magic, no incantation that would knit torn muscle back together in a flash of light. What I had was 10 years spent as an animal control officer back on Earth, a working knowledge of how to set a break and pack a wound clean so it doesn't fester into something worse, and the leather belt I sacrificed on the spot to use as a splint. I worked with what I actually had, which felt, at every step, like nowhere near enough. I kept talking the entire time, low and mostly meaningless words, because the sound of a calm voice seemed to matter to it more than anything I was actually saying. When I finally worked the arrowhead free with a small knife I found, inexplicably, already tucked into my boot, Mira's doing, I'd learn later, though she never once admitted to slipping it there, the manticore screamed. It was a sound like a hawk's cry and a woman weeping, layered together in a register that found something ancient and frightened in my chest and lit it up like a struck match. I will hear that sound in whatever passes from my nightmares now for the rest of however long this second life lasts. And then when it was finally over, when the wound was packed with what herbs I could identify, and the leg was bound tight against a splint, and the worst of the bleeding had, at last, mercifully slowed to something manageable. Unnamed manticore, adult, grievously wounded, bond type, Warden's oath, permanent status. This creature now recognizes you as its alpha. It will follow you, defend you without hesitation, and refuse any command that would endanger itself needlessly. This bond cannot be broken by any third party under any circumstance. The manticore's golden eye found mine again, and this time there was no fear left in it at all. There was something closer to disbelief, the particular, disorienting disbelief of a creature that has just been handed proof, undeniable and immediate, that every rule it had learned about the world up until that exact moment was wrong. I named him Thorn, mostly because it was the first word that came to mind, and partly because he'd spent the better part of 2 hours trying very hard not to flinch each time I touched anywhere near his ruined leg, and the effort of that restraint had felt, to me, like something worth naming. He never walked right again. The break had set jagged under field conditions, with no proper splint for a limb that size, hasty work done by hands still shaking with adrenaline, and no amount of later care could fully undo the damage of those first desperate hours. He limped for the remainder of his life. I limped a little too, in a way. Every single time I thought about the 6 other arrow scars pocking his hide that I hadn't caused, and would never be able to uncause, no matter how much care I poured into the one wound I had managed to close. That was the first real hint of what my gift actually was, underneath the tidy system description. Not raw power, not strength I could point at a threat, a ledger more than anything else. Every scar written into Thorn's hide was a debt someone else had incurred, and simply left lying in the mud for me to eventually find and read. I want to tell you I understood, right then in that gully, exactly what I'd stumbled into. I didn't. I thought I'd rescued one wounded animal, patched him up as best I could, made a friend the plain way a child makes a friend by sharing half a sandwich at recess. I did not yet understand that Warden's oath, permanent, cannot be broken by any third party, meant I had just laid the first plank of something that a great many well-armed, well-organized people were going to become extremely unhappy about, sooner rather than later. I found out about the guilds 2 days later, dragging Thorn, limping, leaning a truly alarming fraction of his weight against my shoulder like the world's least convenient walking stick, back in the general direction of Mira's cottage, when we stumbled across a hunting party's abandoned camp along the way. The cook fire still smoked faintly, embers not yet cold. A cage sat off to one side, empty, its door hanging crooked on one hinge, old blood dried black and flaking on the bars. And half buried in trampled mud nearby, a torn banner, embroidered once in silver thread now gone dull and stained, a fang, curved and pale, on a field of green. The Silver Fang Company, Mira told me later that same evening, not once looking up from the herbs she was methodically grinding into paste, when I finally asked what the banner meant. Adventurers Guild. Biggest operation working this whole stretch of the border, by a considerable margin. They hunt monsters for cores, hides, trophies, whatever fetches coin at market that season. Efficient bunch, I'll give them that. Ruthless, too, Whenever a kill turns out to be more profitable left half alive than finished cleanly. Her eyes flicked toward Thorn, toward the careful way he leaned his enormous bulk away from her cottage wall so as not to bring the whole crooked structure down around us. Looks to me like you've gone and found yourself one of their leftovers. They just leave them? Alive? Cheaper than a proper killing blow, more often than folk like to admit. A core taken from a creature that's still breathing sells fresher, worth better coin, if the harvester knows how to bleed it out slow rather than fast. Company men aren't paid a wage to finish a job clean. They're paid to bring product back to the guild hall, and product doesn't need to be tidy, only sellable. She said all of it without a trace of heat in her voice. The flat recitation of a law of physics she found personally distasteful, but had long since stopped arguing with. You want to go and make yourself an enemy of the largest guild operating this whole border, boy? You keep right on doing exactly what you just did today. Otherwise, you might want to sit with the question of whether one crippled manticore is where all this is meant to end, or whether it's only where it starts. I looked over at Thorn. Thorn looked back at me with his one working golden eye, patient in a way that nothing which had already suffered that badly should, by rights, have had any capacity left to be. It wasn't where it ended. I simply didn't know that yet, sitting there in the last of that evening's light with a splintered manticore breathing steady beside me for what felt, against every reasonable expectation, like the first time in a very long while. Confirmation of exactly how large a problem I'd made for myself came 3 days later, when Thorn and I crossed paths with a lone company scout on the trail back from checking a snare Mira had heard rumor of further downhill. He was young, younger than me even in my old life, wearing the silver fang badge stitched crooked on a cloak clearly one size too large for him. And he went the color of old parchment the instant Thorn's shadow fell across the path in front of him. That's a marked manticore, he said, backing up 2 full steps before his training apparently reminded him he was supposed to be the professional in this exchange. Nobody heals those. Nobody bothers. You just finish them. It's cleaner. It's company policy. Cores don't keep once. He's not for sale, I said. And I remember being a little surprised at how flat and certain my own voice came out. Like some part of me had already decided this fight before my mouth caught up to it. The scout's eyes flicked from Thorn to me and back again, doing some quick and clearly uncomfortable arithmetic. You don't understand how this works, friend. That beast's got a bounty tag from 3 seasons back, still open on the company ledger. Somebody's going to come collect on it eventually, marked or not, healed or not. Bonds don't mean anything to a ledger entry. They mean something to me. He didn't have an answer for that. He backed away another few steps, then turned and half ran back down the trail toward wherever his party was camped. And I stood there, with Thorn's flank warm against my shoulder, turning over the phrase bounty tag in my head, like a stone I didn't much like the shape of. It was the first time I understood, with any real clarity, that healing Thorn hadn't erased whatever debt the company thought the world owed them for his existence. It had only changed who they'd have to go through to collect it. Chapter 3. The Woman Who Stopped Believing in People. A month into my second life, I had learned 3 things with real certainty. First, healing a monster hurts a great deal worse than setting a wound on a human patient ever had, because you're doing the work with half the proper tools and twice the terror of being bitten clean in half if your hands slip at the wrong moment. Second, the Silver Fang Company left considerably more wreckage scattered through these woods than I'd initially wanted to believe, evidence of it turning up everywhere I looked once I knew to start looking. Third, and this one surprised me most, word travels remarkably fast among creatures that have every reason in the world not to trust anyone, once one of their own finds a reason to trust something at all. Thorn found the second lesson's proof for me, or more accurately, he led me straight to it, or rather, all 4 of his noses, because manticores apparently possess a sense of smell that would shame the finest bloodhound back home, dragged the both of us off the main trail and toward a clearing where a woman knelt over a fallen wolf, both bare hands pressed to its side, red past the wrist, sobbing without producing a single audible sound. She heard us coming through the brush well before she saw us clearly. By the time I actually stepped into the clearing, she already had a dagger drawn in her free hand, the blade angled steady at my throat, and an expression on her face that told me plainly she'd use it without so much as a flicker of hesitation if I gave her half a reason to. "Take one more step," she said, voice low and utterly level, "and I will open you from collar to navel before you finish drawing breath to argue." I stopped dead. I raised both hands where she could see every finger clearly, the exact same gesture I'd used on Thorn 2 days before, which was rapidly becoming something of a signature move in this new life of mine. "I'm not with the company," I said, keeping my voice as level as I could manage. "I'm not with anyone at all if that matters to you. I can help, if you let me anywhere near him." "Help." She spat the word like it had gone sour in her mouth. "I've heard that particular offer before, stranger. Right before the help in question put an arrow clean through my familiar's spine for the crime of standing between them and an easy purse of coin. That was Ren. I didn't learn her name until well after the immediate crisis had passed. I was quickly developing a habit of meeting people in the exact middle of their worst moment and only learning who they actually were once the worst of it had blown through. She was a druid, bonded for 6 years running to the wolf pack she ran the forest alongside, and the wolf dying beneath her hands in that clearing was the very last member of that pack, still drawing breath. The Silverfang Company had hunted the rest of them down for pelts only the week before. This one had run, badly wounded, further than any creature with a punctured lung had any right to manage, and Ren had followed the blood trail for 2 straight days without rest to finally catch up to him. I didn't argue with the knife hovering at my throat. I simply knelt down at the wolf's other side, slow and deliberate, and started working with what I had, letting her decide with every single second that passed whether to finally open my throat or let me continue. She let me work. I think, looking back, some part of her recognized, even through the raw grief still choking her, that I wasn't lying about what I could actually do. Or maybe by that point, she simply had nothing left worth losing by letting one stranger try where she'd already run out of options herself. Either way, an hour later the wolf's breathing had steadied into something less like a death rattle, the worst of the wound packed and bound tight with strips torn straight from my own shirt, and Ren was staring at me with the dagger forgotten entirely, hanging slack and useless in her hand. "You're the one," she said slowly, like she was testing the words against something she'd already heard. "The Manticore. Words already moving fast through the border villages, stranger. Man who mends what the company throws away and doesn't ask for coin in return. Didn't realize I'd already earned a reputation. You have one now, whether you asked for it or not." She looked down at the wolf, breathing steady under her own palm now, and something in her face cracked open in a way I don't think she'd allowed it to crack in a very long time. I stopped believing people were worth saving anything for, going on 5 years back now. Watched too many hunters smile at me across a shared campfire while their friends finished off things I'd loved, 2 ridges over, conveniently out of earshot. Very convenient, that arrangement. Never having to actually hear it happen. She lifted her eyes back to mine. "You're either the exception to everything I've learned since, or you're simply the most convincing liar I've come across since. I'm not lying to you. We'll see soon enough." But she stayed anyway. She helped me carry the wolf the long way back toward Mira's cottage. And somewhere in that walk, I honestly couldn't tell you the precise moment it happened. She stopped trailing 2 careful steps behind me like a wary escort and started walking beside me instead, like something a good deal closer to a companion. We talked that long walk back, in the fragmented way 2 exhausted strangers talk, when neither one has the energy left to be fully guarded. She told me about the pack, 6 years of it, built one careful bond at a time after the first wolf, a half-starved pup she'd found nearly a decade back, had imprinted on her the old druidic way and never once left her side since. She told me, flat and without any dramatic flourish, exactly how the company had found them. A licensed cull, paperwork stamped and approved by some magistrate 3 towns over, who'd never once set foot in these woods, 6 wolves listed on the order, and 7 actually run down, because nobody at the guild hall ever bothered counting past what the contract required. You could report that, I said. Couldn't you? To someone. She laughed, short and entirely without humor. Report it to whom exactly? The same magistrate who signed the Carl order in the first place? The company keeps its own books, stranger, and its own friends in high enough places to make sure the books stay convenient. I learned that lesson the hard way the first time I tried, 3 years back, and lost a second pup to their accidental oversight while the paperwork on the first complaint was still sitting on some clerk's desk gathering dust. I didn't have a good answer for that. I still don't, if I'm honest, all this time later. I only had what I'd already been doing without any grand plan behind it. Bandages, patience, and a stubborn refusal to look away from something bleeding just because looking away would have been considerably easier on everyone involved. Wolf, bonded familiar of druid Ren. Bond type, Warden's Oath. Secondary bond status. This creature already carries a druidic bond to Ren. Your Warden's Oath layers atop the existing bond rather than replacing or competing with it. It now recognizes you as alpha of its pack in addition to its established druidic bond. This is a rare configuration. Even the system itself seemed a touch surprised by that particular notification. I didn't fully understand what rare configuration actually meant until much later, when Mira explained that druidic bonds were, by their very nature, jealous and exclusive things, rarely willing to share a creature's loyalty with any second claim laid over the top. My gift finding a way to sit peacefully alongside one instead of fighting it for ground was its own small, quiet kind of miracle. The first sign I had that this strange power of mine might work with the world rather than only against it. Ren didn't leave once we reached the cottage either. She told me plainly, sitting across the fire that night with the wolf, she'd named him Bram, after her own late father, which told me a great deal more about her in that single choice than any hour of conversation could have, resting between us. That she didn't trust me yet, and didn't expect to for some good while longer. But that she'd rather watch a stranger's hands mend things than watch any more hunters' hands break them apart. And that if I intended to keep walking these particular woods hunting down the company's leftovers, she meant to walk them alongside me, if only to be certain I did the work properly. I didn't argue with that either. I was beginning to understand, slowly and without quite meaning to, that I wasn't going to be doing any of this alone for very much longer. Mira's reaction to Ren when we finally reached the cottage well past dark was not what I expected. I'd braced for some territorial friction, two women who healed the world in very different ways, sizing each other up over who had the better claim to it. Instead, Mira took one look at Ren's tear-swollen eyes and the wolf cradled between us, and simply stepped back from her own doorway to let us both in without a word of comment, which I would come to learn was, from Mira, something close to a warm embrace. "Druid," she said, once Bram was settled by the fire and breathing easy. It wasn't a question either, same as everything else out of her mouth tended not to be. "Herbalist," Ren returned, and something passed between the two of them that I didn't have the context yet to read. Recognition, maybe, or the particular shorthand of two women who'd both spent years mending things the world around them preferred broken. "I knew a druid once," Mira said, turning back to her herbs, in a tone that closed the subject as firmly as it had opened it. "Bad business how that ended. You'll want willow bark for the wolf's fever, not the yarrow you've likely already used. Second shelf, left side." Ren didn't ask what bad business meant, and I didn't either, not that night. I filed it away instead, the way I was learning to file away most of the things this new world offered up in fragments, rather than whole stories. Mira's old grief about wardens who'd walked this path before me. Whatever history sat between her and druids in general. The shape of a life she'd clearly lived long before I ever stumbled bleeding into her woods. I had a feeling, even then, that all of it would matter eventually. I just didn't yet know how much. Chapter 4. The Warden Who Turned in Her Own. By the third month, Thorn's limp had settled into simply being a fact of how he moved through the world, rather than a wound I found myself thinking about every waking hour. Bram, the wolf, though Ren's name for him had stuck fast within the first week, had regained most of his old strength. enough to range a short distance ahead of us on the trail again, tail held high in a way Wren told me she hadn't seen since before the cull. I'd picked up 2 more strays in those weeks I don't have room to detail in full here. A crowhawk with a wing that never quite set true, no matter how carefully I splinted it, and something small and burrowing that I'm still not entirely convinced was a natural creature at all, but which followed me everywhere regardless, underfoot and cheerfully in the way. Word of the man who mends the company's leftovers had by then spread well past the handful of border villages closest to Mira's cottage, all the way out to the game wardens who patrolled the deeper woods on the Crown's own authority, which is how, in due course, I came to meet Kestrel. She found me, notably, rather than the reverse, which was new. I was elbow-deep in cleaning a puncture wound along the crowhawk's ruined wing when a woman in ranger's leathers dropped out of the canopy directly in front of me, without so much as a warning rustle of leaves, her bow already slack against her side, both hands held loosely open in a gesture that told me she'd already made a decision about me long before she spoke her first word. "You're the one everyone's been talking about," she said. It wasn't phrased as a question. "Depends rather a lot on which everyone you mean." "The villages mostly. The company too, though they don't say your name near so fondly when they say it." She crouched down across from me without being invited, studying the crowhawk's wing with the unmistakable eye of a professional. "That's a poacher's snared wound on that wing, not a company arrow's work. Someone's been running illegal traps 2 ridges north of here, catching game they've no permit to touch and no license whatsoever to sell at market." I looked up at her properly for the first time. Sharp eyes, sharper cheekbones, the specific weathered calm of someone who'd spent considerably more years living inside a forest than inside any town's walls. "You're a warden, then? Crown appointed, for what that's worth some days." She said it flatly, the recitation of a job title too many times repeated to still carry any real pride behind it. "I patrol this stretch of woods, keep the licensed hunting parties honest where I can, and drag the unlicensed ones in front of a magistrate whenever I actually manage to catch them in the act. Which is, in theory, a fine and useful job." She paused, jaw tightening slightly. "In practice, half of what I do all day is watch the Silver Fang Company operate just inside the letter of their license while doing precisely what the poachers do outside it. And there's not a court in 3 provinces willing to touch them for it. Too much coin changes hands upstream. Too many magistrates with pockets already comfortably lined." "So, why exactly are you telling all of this to me?" She nodded toward the crowhawk, still cradled carefully in my hands. "Because you're doing, apparently for free, out of whatever it is that drives a man to do it, the exact thing I've spent 6 years failing to accomplish with a warrant, a badge, and the Crown's own authority behind me. I can't arrest the company for cruelty. There's no statute on the books that covers it, not one that survives contact with their lawyers anyway. But I can tell you precisely where their traps sit hidden. I can bring you the poachers I do manage to lawfully catch, the small, unlicensed, genuinely illegal ones too stupid to keep themselves inside the law's protection, and let you decide what's worth saving before some magistrate decides what's worth quietly selling off instead." That was Kestrel's offer, laid out plain as dirt between us, no romance dressing it up, no particular drama to the delivery. Just 2 people who'd each independently discovered that the system surrounding them had been built, quietly and thoroughly, to reward cruelty and punish mercy, deciding together to simply work around that system rather than waste more years fighting it head-on. I said yes without much hesitation. Of course I said yes. "Alliance registered. Crown Warden Kestrel. Non-bond cooperative status. Note, this individual is not a creature and cannot be Warden bonded. However, her ongoing cooperation grants passive access to regional poaching and cull reports. New wounded creatures may now be located approximately 40% faster within Kestrel's designated patrol territory." I laughed out loud when that particular notification surfaced because of course the system had a tidy mechanical answer for "I just made a genuine friend, too," filed away neatly under some category of alliance bonus. Kestrel asked, understandably, what exactly was so funny. I didn't have any good way to explain a floating status window that only I could see, so I simply told her, "Nothing much. and let her go on thinking I was a bit strange, which, in fairness, I very likely was by that point. Over the following weeks, she made steady good on her offer. She'd find me at Mira's cottage, or out along the trail with Thorn and Bram and the Crowhawk trailing somewhere overhead like the world's strangest possible parade, and hand over whatever she'd gathered. A trapper working 3 valleys east without any license at all. A hunting party that turned out, on closer inspection, to be nothing more than 3 drunk mercenaries running illegal snares for a bit of quick, unreported coin. I'd go wherever she pointed. Sometimes I found something worth saving on arrival. Sometimes I found only enough evidence to hand straight back to her, letting her finally do her job with some actual teeth behind it for once, instead of watching the guilty walk free yet again on some technicality bought and paid for in advance. One particular afternoon stands out clearly, even now. Kestrel led me 2 ridges over to a stand of birch where a trio of poachers had strung snares thick enough to catch anything unlucky enough to wander through. Rabbits, certainly, but also, judging by the trampled ground and torn fur caught on the wire, something considerably larger that had thrashed itself half to death, trying to break free before finally tearing loose and fleeing wounded deeper into the woods. We tracked the blood trail together, Kestrel reading sign I would never have noticed on my own, until we found a young stag, foreleg mangled by wire wound tight enough to have cut nearly to the bone. "Yours if you want him," she said, already turning to deal with dismantling the snares themselves, methodical and unhurried, like she'd done this exact task 100 times before, and expected to do it 100 more. "I'll have the trappers in front of a magistrate by week's end. Illegal snares, no license, verified game theft. That one, at least, I can make stick." It was Kestrel, in fact, who first told me, flat, without any embellishment at all, the way she seemed to deliver every piece of news, whether good or bad, exactly what the Silverfang Company had begun saying about me in the border taverns by that point. "They're calling you a poacher yourself, if you can believe the irony," she said, not quite managing to hide her own amusement at the phrase. "Say you're taming their revenue. Had one of their lieutenants corner me himself, just last week, wanting to know outright whether the Crown Warden service was in on it with you, whether I'd been feeding you roots on purpose, specifically to cut into company profits." "Are you? In on it, I mean?" "Obviously I am." She grinned, the first genuinely unguarded grin I'd seen crack her weathered composure since we'd met. Wasn't about to admit that to him, mind you. It took another few weeks of working alongside her before Kestrel volunteered why any of this mattered to her personally, rather than simply as a matter of professional principle. We were sitting out a sudden downpour under a rock overhang, waiting for a swollen stream to drop back to affordable level when she finally told me. "My father held this exact patrol before me," she said, watching the rain come down in sheets past the overhang's edge. 30 years near enough. Crown Warden, same as I am now. Company tried to buy him off twice that I know of. Quiet coin, the kind that doesn't show up in any ledger, just to look the other way on their call quotas. He turned it down both times." She was quiet a moment. "Third time, they didn't offer coin. He had an accident on patrol instead. Fell from a ridge he'd walked 1,000 times without incident, they said. Nobody investigated too hard. Nobody ever does when the company's the one filling in the report." "You think they killed him?" "I know they did. Knowing it and proving it in front of a magistrate who's already been paid to disbelieve me are 2 very different exercises." She looked over at me then, something hard and steady behind her eyes. "So no, I don't do this purely out of principle, whatever fine speech I gave you back when we met. I do it because every poacher I drag in front of an honest judge, every trap I dismantle, every creature I steer your way instead of the company's ledger is one more small piece of the debt they owe my father that they'll never actually have to pay in full, but I mean to make them feel the weight of it anyway, for as long as I've got breath left to keep doing it." I didn't have anything adequate to offer back for that. I just sat with her under the overhang until the rain finally eased and the stream dropped low enough to cross, and understood, a little better than before, exactly why she'd chosen to hand a stranger with a strange gift her father's old, unfinished fight. Chapter 5. The Year Mark. A year is a strange unit of time to measure a new life by, all things considered, but it's the measure that stuck in my mind because it's the one Mira eventually used when she finally sat me down properly and made me look, with real clarity for the first time, at exactly what I'd built without ever quite noticing I was building it. By then, my little procession through the woods had long since stopped being a joke among the border villages and started being something that made even hardened adventurers step well clear of the trail to let us pass unhindered. Thorn led at my left shoulder as always, limp and all, a solid wall of scarred muscle that nothing with any sense picked a fight with anymore. Bram's pack had grown past just himself. 3 more strays had found their way to us over the intervening months, culled survivors of other guild harvests scattered through the region, each one bonded the same careful way, each one settling without my ever once giving an explicit order into a natural hierarchy beneath Bram that somehow, without any effort on my part, still put me squarely at the top of it all. The crowhawk scouted the trail ahead from the safety of the canopy. Digger, the burrowing thing whose actual species I never did manage to properly identify, tunneled along somewhere underfoot, popping up at irregular intervals wherever it had decided the ground most urgently needed checking. And then, more recently than any of the others, there was the one-eyed basilisk. I hadn't planned on a basilisk. Nobody, I imagine, ever really plans on a basilisk. Kestrel had brought me word of a hunting incident gone sideways nearly 2 months back. A company party that had cornered something considerably above their contracted pay grade, panicked hard when the engagement turned against them and left it half-blinded and slowly dying at the bottom of a collapsed quarry rather than risk their own necks finishing the job properly. The quarry itself had been the easy part to find. Getting anywhere near what waited at the bottom of it was another matter entirely. It lay coiled around its own ruined eye, scales matted dark with old blood, and the one working eye it had left was precisely the kind of eye every story back home had warned children never to meet. A basilisk's gaze doesn't kill outright the way legend likes to claim, Mira had told me before I left, but it can freeze a man solid with fear long enough for the teeth to finish the job regardless, which amounts to much the same thing in practice. I spent the better part of that first day simply sitting at the quarry's rim, in view but out of range, doing nothing more dramatic than being visibly, boringly present. The second day, I came a little closer and did the same. By the third day, it had stopped flinching every time I shifted my weight. By the fourth, exhausted past the point of proper caution and clearly in more pain than pride could sustain any longer, it let me close the last of the distance. The wound itself was old enough that half the work wasn't healing so much as cleaning out infection that should have killed it a week prior. Necrotic tissue I had to cut away with hands that shook worse than I ever let show, packing what remained with everything in Mira's satchel that might conceivably help, and hoping the rest sorted itself out through sheer stubbornness. It never did open that ruined eye again. Even now, months on from that first careful approach, it still wouldn't meet my remaining working eye straight on, some old, deep animal shame in it that no amount of patient gentleness on my part had ever fully managed to unwind. But it followed. It followed the exact same way all of them followed by that point, not out of fear of what I might do otherwise, not out of any command I'd given, but out of something that looked, unmistakably, and every single time I saw it, like genuine belonging. Mira watched all of this play out from her porch one particular evening, grinding herbs she plainly didn't strictly need to be grinding, and finally said the thing she'd apparently been sitting on, turning over privately for some good while. You understand what you've actually built here, don't you? Truly understand it, I mean. Not merely felt your way through the doing of it one crippled creature at a time. I've built a very strange sort of family, I said, and meant it. You've built an army the Silver Fang Company cannot touch. She set down her mortar and pestle with a deliberate, final little click, and looked at me properly for the first time in weeks, the way she hadn't quite managed since that very first morning I'd woken up in her woods. Every creature bonded to you represents coin their coffers will never again see. No core harvest from it, no hide sale, No trophy mount hung proudly over some minor lordling's fireplace. A year back, you were one broke, confused stranger with an unimpressive-sounding gift and no earthly idea what to do with it. Now you're sitting on the single resource in this entire region that the company cannot buy off you, cannot threaten out of you, and cannot simply hunt away from you by force because the bond itself does not break. It does not matter how many soldiers they send after the fact. It does not matter what they eventually offer in trade. What's bonded to you stays bonded to you, right up until it dies quietly of old age in your own care, rather than bleeding out slowly in some hunter's snare for the sake of somebody else's profit. I hadn't ever quite framed it to myself in those particular terms before. I'd thought of the whole year as bandages and patience and a great many very long, very frightening nights spent kneeling beside something large enough to kill me entirely by accident if my hands slipped even once. Mira was the first person to say the quiet part out loud, plainly and without softening it, that a solid year of nothing more dramatic than careful bandaging had built something the company was now going to have to reckon with directly, whether any of them particularly wanted to or not. They've noticed for what it's worth. Kestrel confirmed for me a few days later, catching up with me out on the trail. She wasn't smiling this time, which told me plenty on its own before she'd said a single further word. Guilds called an emergency council session over it, first one in over a year by what my sources inside tell me. Word passed along says they're finished calling you a mere nuisance. Lieutenant Husk himself stood up in front of the full assembled hall last week and said, and I'm quoting this directly because I want you to hear exactly how they've chosen to frame the matter, that man is taming our revenue out from under us, and if we let this continue even one more year unchecked, he'll have every profitable bloodline in this entire region eating out of his hand instead of properly dying at the end of our arrows, same as it's always been. Ren, walking at my other side that day with Bram pressed close against her leg, the way he always kept himself when he sensed her mood darken, laughed, short, entirely without humor, and not remotely surprised by any of it. Took them a full year just to notice that a man armed with nothing but bandages was more dangerous to their business than a man armed with any sword could ever be. That's the company all over, through and through. Slow as winter mud to notice anything that doesn't already carry a price tag stitched onto it somewhere. I looked back down the trail at what I'd built without ever quite meaning to build it. A limping manticore who trusted me now with his life without reservation. A one-eyed basilisk still slowly learning what safety even felt like after a lifetime without it. A wolf pack rebuilt entirely out of the company's own careless discards. A druid who'd sworn off believing people were worth saving anything for and had decided, slowly and against her own better judgment, that I might just be the one exception worth the risk. A crown warden who fed me every poacher her own badge couldn't otherwise touch, and a healer sitting on a porch who'd apparently seen this exact gift walk through these woods once before, long enough ago to know precisely how dangerous it would eventually become, once the people profiting steadily off cruelty finally understood in full what patient, stubborn mercy could ultimately cost them. A year ago, I died from the bite of the single, gentlest creature I had ever personally known. A year later, the gentlest thing about me was rapidly becoming the only reason the Silverfang Company hadn't yet found the clean way to make me simply disappear. I didn't know, standing there on Mira's porch that particular evening with the last light going gold and thick through the trees, that the council session Kestrel had described wasn't merely talk passed idly around the guild hall. I didn't know yet how close they had already come to deciding, in that same emergency session, that I was worth the very real risk of an entirely different kind of hunting party, one with my name specifically written at the top of its contract, instead of some wounded creatures. I would find that out soon enough. Sooner, in fact, than I had any real reason to expect.